Okay, welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural. Try that again. Welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green, and this is, I think, lecture 13 now in our course Intro to Critical Theory. We are going to be reading through Wendy Brown's essay here. All of the readings are on the ccctheory.org site, as well as the syllabus for the course if you're interested and you're just tuning in. I oftentimes write out my lectures, but I'm kind of trying to get ahead right now, and I just want to kind of maneuver through the reading. I also think that because Brown's piece here is less, it's just more recently written, so it maybe the language is a little bit less obscure for the general reader than like trying to read through some of the Frankfurt School theorists like Horkheimer or Adorno or Marcuse. Although Marcuse, of course, makes an appearance in this essay. We have also jumped into the present, right? So the last lecture was on Emmanuel Levinas, who's not a critical theorist, but his reflections on the philosophy of Hitlerism. And what he was doing was pointing out something that the critical theorists in the 1940s would point out, which is that if we really, really take a deep dive or a deep look at so-called Western culture, what I term Euro-Christian culture, for various reasons that I won't go into here. But when you hear me use that term, you can kind of um, uh, like map it onto the way people conventionally say white, but also Western civilization, Euro-Christian civilization. For me, capitalism, for example, is an expression of Euro-Christian civilization, as is liberalism. We can talk about that at another time. It makes my language a little bit different, though, from Wendy Brown and other theorists, and I just want to point that perspectival difference out. Another difference, just to be kind of clear, in terms of maybe a different angle for my own thinking. I tend to, in my lectures and in my teaching, um, pull back and even suggest to students that they pull back on trying to codify or point out where a thinker is left or right. And it's partly because for me, when I'm looking at the 21st century, I'm not sure that the metaphors from the French Revolution, which is where we get left and right, that horizontal metaphor, are necessarily adequate for the ways that we might think about political formation in the 21st century. This is not the place to dive into that. And I did write a book, and in my book, as I refer to my students, uh, I use the term political theological vortex. That's me. That's just Roger Green. That's my term for things that that a situation where things that might have seemed traditionally to be on the right all of a sudden seem like they're the left are advocating for it, or the left seem to be shifting right. We can't quite tell. That's why I say the vortex is just kind of a blah. Yeah. And uh, so I will even resist at times sort of um, um, formulating my own identity, and I don't necessarily think it's useful for students to like try and peg my politics. Like I'm trying to help people read and learn and understand this sort of stuff. That's my main agenda here. Of course, I have my own personal opinions about lots of stuff too, and they bleed in here, right? I'm a human being. There is no, I don't believe that there's some sort of objective way to do this kind of stuff. But just as the critical theorists and critical theory tells us that the subject, the theorist, has to be aware of their own situation and their own situatedness, right, in culture as well. And so I say all of that because Wendy Brown, I do think it's useful in this particular essay to note that Wendy Brown is writing from an angle that I would call both liberal and leftist in the liberal sense, but not leftist in the Marxist or Leninist sense, as we've covered in previous lectures. And we'll see her opinions on Marx as we get going here. We'll also see the ways that she is drawing on critical theory and the methods of critical theory to do her analysis, which I think is in many ways a really good analysis of the situation. I might point out a few differences in my own thinking, but really these contextualized lectures or contextualized readings are about sort of me being a translator, right? That's probably where my talent is as a thinker, is helping to translate complex ideas for my students or for a wider population. I know this material is super hard to read, especially if you're not trained in philosophy at times. You can't get all of the references that these people are referring to. So speaking of references, let's jump in here and to the title. So when we think about neoliberalism's Frankenstein, which she doesn't say much about Frankenstein in the text. So if you remember the story of Frankenstein, Frankenstein is actually the name of the doctor, right, who creates this, tries to create life in his lab, and he does end up creating life. Prometheus Unbound, right, as uh, Mary Shelley kind of refers to it. So he does sort of, in playing God, try to does allow life to happen, but then the life, his creation, turns into a monster, and then comes back to chase him. And so the metaphor here is like what has gone awry with this creation called neoliberalism. That's going to be really important to understanding how Wendy Brown is giving us a history of neoliberalism here. For a lot of grad students, and I'm going to pick on some of my grad students, I know a lot of times like neoliberalism just becomes like a capture word for like all of the bad things. And yeah, like maybe there are bad things that come from neoliberalism, as Wendy Brown is going to tell us. But when we look at her analysis, what I think the depth of what she's saying is that neoliberalism in theory arises in the late 1930s, around the same time that some of the critical theorists that we've already been reading are writing, and they really intend to create an economic policy or an economical kind of approach that is anti-fascist. But what has come out of it, according to Brown's reading here, is a new form of fascism that has come back to bite neoliberalism. And that's what she's going to explain in the essay. That's like the gist of things here. Just another sort of thing, because again, like when I'm asking students like to hold back on like that kind of left-right dichotomy, because in popular speak, especially in the United States, liberal means something like left, and conservative means right. But we're talking about liberalism to begin with, which is a political formation and an economic formation that privileges individuals who are capable of bearing these things called rights. So, in a political economy sense, a much broader sense, um, uh, mainline conservatives and liberals, mainline Republicans and Democrats, fall into an economy of liberalism, right? That's like the economy that the earlier theorists that we've been reading, like Lenin, are pushing against, like a liberal democracy, right? Liberal democracy does not mean that it doesn't have Republicans or a right wing in it, right? Um, So we're narrowing things down a little bit to a United States perspective here. And within the United States political perspective, Wendy Brown is going to identify as liberal both in the political economic sense and in the sense of being on the left, as opposed to the right in U.S. politics. If we go, like some of you, I know a lot of my YouTube audience is in Asia, for example, and so want to be really careful about like uh, transporting some of the ideas that are really speaking to recent conditions in the United States, and then just attaching them to Modi in India. I mean, I think that there can be some overlap, right? There has been a rise in right-wing power that is global with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and with Brexit, as is mentioned here. So there is that phenomenon, but I also want to stress that a lot of the kind of white supremacy stuff that's showing up here are seems to be something that is particular to the United States. It's not that white supremacy doesn't have a rise in other, especially European countries. But when we look at something, at say Asian countries or something like that, I'm not sure that that discussion is going to be as important. And for those of you in Asia, another writer here who we're not reading for this course is a writer from India. His name is Pankaj Mishra, and he has a book called Age of Anger, where he talks, and he doesn't have the same argument as Wendy Brown, but he gives a really nice account of resentment or ressentiment, the stuff that Brown is going to talk about with Nietzsche in here, and attaching it to like forms of masculinity, to forms of aggression, and to forms of right-wing power. That's going to be a little bit. It's just a more global discussion in Mishra's book, and so I just suggest it to people here. Okay, so let's dig into Wendy Brown. She has a couple of quotes here from people who are on the right. So, of course, Marine Le Pen in France, uh, um, uh, her own father was close to the founder of the Nouvelle Droite, or the New Right in France. That would be Alain Benoist, um, uh, who is an important intellectual in terms of right-wing politics, and there are the bombasts, there are the people like Trump who gets talked about in here. There's the kind of unfettered aggression of something like white supremacist stuff with the Proud Boys, and then there's the kind of intellectual side. And I think that it is worth in anyone who's really trying to do the critical work here needs to sort of be aware of that. So we might it's not always fun to read people whose politics are really different than ours, but at least it helps us unpack the logic of where some of the stuff is coming from. Another quote from The Guardian here. Um, uh, Referencing Brexit, and then Milo Yiannopoulos videos here. And then we'll just dig in here. I'm not going to be able to, I don't think I'm going to read it all the way out like I did with the Levy analysis. I know that that takes a long time, but it's thorough work. But I think that Wendy Brown's language will be familiar enough to a lot of my contemporary readers. But let's dig into her introduction. If you don't read academic articles, which is what this is, or if you're one of my students, this is the kind of thing that we want to see in term papers and stuff. There's generally an intro, body, and a conclusion, just like regular essays. And the thesis statement usually comes at the end of the introduction, which is not the end of the first paragraph. But if we scan down rhetorically, if we look at the form, there's usually a section break. And there's usually a lot of packed argument, like I've got highlighted here at the end of the introduction. So just a little bit of literacy for how very common forms of academic arguments are put into place. And so I'll kind of point some of that stuff out as we go on. So she opens her essay here. A predominantly white, uneducated, and evangelical Christian population animated by discontent, rage, woundedness, or all three brought Donald Trump to power. So let's like just really quickly here jump back up. So this is volume 1 and issue 1 of a journal called Critical Times. Um, uh, and so she's writing, just thinking about the time period where she's writing after the first Trump election, but before January 6th, right? So she'll have some different stuff, some more updated stuff that's post-January, um, uh, that's post-January 6th. So that's not referenced here. So Donald Trump comes to power, and there's some sort of combination of all of these things. She says, yes, he drew support from some educated whites, from some racial minorities, from the ultra rich, from some ultra Zionist, and the alt right. But, she says, his electoral base was and remains white American voters without a college degree, many of whom forthrightly acknowledged that he was unqualified to be president. So his voting base acknowledged that he's unqualified to be president. If you remember back to 2016 election, what was the campaign for Hillary Clinton saying? She's the most qualified person to be in office because of her history. She used to be the first lady. She used to be Secretary of State, right? She's like got a really like a legacy resume. And what the voters that were supporting Trump were saying was like, we don't want that kind of legacy, right? When we don't care if the person we vote for is unqualified to be president. Trump mobilized not simply class resentment, but white rancor, especially white male rancor about lost pride of place, social, economic, cultural, and political in the context of 4 decades of neoliberalism's globalization. So she hasn't defined what neoliberalism is yet, right? We'll get into that. But she says that we've had 4 decades of it at this point. So it's at least the early 80s. In fact, neoliberalism, as she says, and post-Fordism before it have been far more devastating to the Black American working class. In 1970, more than 2/3 of urban Black workers and blue-collar jobs or had blue collar jobs. By 1987, that had dropped to 28%. In addition to rising and underemployment, poor and working class Black neighborhoods were hard hit by neoliberal defunding of public schools, services, and welfare benefits, and draconian sentencing mandates for nonviolent crimes. The crack epidemic, right? That's one of the things she's referring to there. Together, these resulted in an exploding drug and gang economy, a catastrophic Black incarceration rate, and a growing chasm between the possibilities for a small Black middle class and social, economic, and political abandonment of the rest of African America. But this devastation is the stuff of broken promises, not backward-looking rancor about lost supremacy or entitlement, not crushed political and social imagos of the self, the race, and the nation. So she's characterizing that, yes, like neoliberalism has been devastating to people across the board, no matter what, how somebody might identify in terms of race or even gender. But she's saying that the rancor that has arisen among white males in particular has to do with a sentiment that they had something that they have now lost. They had a kind of supremacy, they had a socially privileged situation. Sometimes we might call this white privilege, and that has been taken away from them. Whereas uh, um, Black folks, and by and large, have been historically marginalized from the society. And yes, the civil rights gains of the 1960s might have made promises for them, and there might have been some gains in the early 70s, but then those promises are not fulfilled. And then things get even worse for um, uh, at least the black middle and lower class in the United States, right? So again, this is like I think the U.S. context is really important to be keeping awareness of here, even though she jumps over to Europe in the next paragraph. So she says clearly white backlash against socioeconomic dethronement by neoliberal economic policy and what even Marine Le Pen in France, right, termed savage globalization is rampant across the Euro-Atlantic, where white working and middle class inhabitants facing declining access to decent incomes, housing, schools, pensions, and futures have risen up in political rebellion against imagined dark usurpers and also against the cosmopolitans and elites they hold responsible for throwing open the doors of their nations and throwing them away. What she's trying to now account for is the blaming of immigration, right? Especially in the United States at the southern border, but also the rise of anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim sentiment among white supremacists. And that anti-Muslim sentiment is definitely going to cross over with Europe, which has seen a much larger um, influx of immigrants from uh, the Islamic world. So she says, this much we know. But what is the political form of this anger and its mobilization? We can see this resentment out in society culturally, but what's the political form, she's asking? The old terms commonly bandied about to describe it, populism, authoritarianism, or fascism, inadequately capture the strange brew of bellicosity, of like warlikeness, disinhibition, and anti-democratic blend of license and support for statism, uh, in current political and social formations, nor do they identify the specific elements of neoliberal reason, a radical extended reach of the private, mistrust of the political, and disavowal of the social, which together normalize inequality and disembowel democracy that shaped and legitimize these angry white right political passions. And they do not capture the deep nihilism, making values into playthings, truth inconsequential, and the future a matter of indifference or worse, an unconscious object of destruction. So here she's laid the blame, or at least part of the blame here, on neoliberalism itself. Neoliberalism is the economic condition that gives rise to the political situation um, in which this kind of acting out of rage and anger, um, the rise of unapologetic racism, um, uh, 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 kind of brutish claims of like masculinity reclaiming like manhood, sorts of things. Somebody was doing this in a talk last week, that I was on for in a critical theory thing. It's like saying that I'm all unapologetically a man, right? That's like I mean, if you need to say that sort of thing, I don't know what it says about you and your comfort with your own masculinity. I self-identify as a man myself, but I don't really feel the need, some deep need to like be unapologetic about my gender. Um, So now we need to understand a little bit more about what neoliberalism is and how it does this kind of thing. But I just want to look at this sentence here. They don't identify the specific elements of neoliberalism, and she's going to give us a little bit of a glimpse here of her definition of neoliberalism. I'm going to highlight it here. A radically extended reach of the private spheres, mistrust of the political, and disavowal of the social, which together normalize inequality and disembowel democracy. So neoliberalism is an economic policy that is set up, it's first formulated in the late 1930s as an attempt to um, be a defense against fascism. But the result of that, according to Wendy Brown, is that it has turned back in Frankenstein's monster fashion and disemboweled democracy in liberal democracies like the United States. So she goes on and she's going to unpack this. She says, in what follows, again, like thesis statement, this is what I'm going to do in my paper, right? And what follows this conjuncture from that I explore this conjuncture from just one angle, right? She has multiple books where she does it from multiple angles, and they're worth reading. What generates the anti-political yet libertarian and authoritarian dimensions of popular right-wing reaction today? What novel iterations and expressions of freedom have been wrought from the conjuncture of neoliberal reason, aggrieved white male power, nationalism, and unavowed nihilism? How has freedom become the calling card and the energy of a formation so manifestly unemancipatory, indeed routinely characterized as heralding illiberal democracy and its attacks on equal rights, its attacks on civil liberties, its attacks on constitutionalism, and basic norms of tolerance and inclusion, and in its affirmation of white nationalism, strong statism, and authoritarian leaders? It's a long question there. How? These just lists of questions that she's going to try and give us answers to in this essay. How and why have freedom and illiberalism, freedom and authoritarianism, freedom and legitimized social exclusion and social violence become fused in our time? How has this fusion developed appeal and modest legitimacy in formerly liberal democratic nations? She's not just talking about the United States there. Um, this essay, she says, does not provide the genealogy that would answer these questions comprehensively, but it offers a first foray. And again, I would say Pankaj Mishra, I mean, read Wendy Brown's books too, but Pankaj Mishra is a good complementary voice who has quite a bit to say about critical theory too. So the essay doesn't give a comprehensive genealogy, but it offers a first foray. It follows the several historical tributaries and builds on the unlikely theoretical trio of Friedrich Hayek, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Herbert Marcuse. An economist, a philosopher, rather conservative philosopher, but wild philosopher that Nietzsche was, and Herbert Marcuse, a critical theorist, of course, as we well know from this class. So she says Hayek for an account of political rationality of our time, Nietzsche and Marcuse for accounts of the rancorous, disinhibited, antisocial, and nihilistic aggression exploding within it. The way she's going to deal with Herbert Marcuse in this essay is through his concept of repressive tolerance. So you can see my agenda in having us read this essay at this point in our course. I'm wanting to give you a contemporary example of how a critical theorist like Wendy Brown would use this and employ passive critical theory, and that I hope will give my students more incentive to dig into Herbert Marcuse when we get to his essay on repressive tolerance in a few weeks here. So I wanted to bring us into the contemporary moment this week with Wendy Brown and then with Glenn Sean Coulthard after this. And then we'll go back and start filling in more of the gaps from the between the 1940s and up to the 21st century again. So that's the organization of the class. So how is she going to do this in her essay? She's given us this really nice account of these questions that she wants to answer. She says she's going to use Hayek, Nietzsche, and Marcuse, so that's going to structure her essay, right? And so the first part of her essay here is going to be just an account of neoliberalism itself, right? And so she says neoliberalism is commonly understood as a set of economic policies promoting unrestricted actions, flows, and accumulations of capital by means of low tariffs and taxes, deregulation of industries, privatization of formerly public goods and services, stripped out welfare states, and the breakup of organized labor. It is a push away from public school investment towards charter schools or private schools. Is that it is a divestment in the public good. And this is partly of what makes it partly neo in terms of liberalism as opposed to classic liberalism. So and Noam Chomsky has a good way of articulating this. Like in classic liberalism, um, even when we're looking at robber barons and capitalists from the 19th century in America, like the Carnegies or the Vanderbilts, right? The train people who are building massive, massive amounts of wealth in the 19th century. In that form of liberalism and capitalism, the idea really was that um, what you do with your wealth as a capitalist is that you reinvest it back into public culture. And that's where we get like, cities being built in the 19th century with like massive like city parks in the middle, with the funding that funds museums, performing arts complexes, the big public institutions. That's what classic liberalism and classic capitalism tries to do. Um, in Adam Smith, for example, um, classic theorist of liberalism and capitalism, um, all of your life is not reduced to the market, right? All of human life is not reduced to the market. In neoliberalism, it is. So that's what puts the neo there. And so neoliberalism, again, just again and again and again for my American students, neoliberalism is not neo-democrat or something like that, right? Neoliberal policies are put in place. I mean, they're theorized beforehand, but they're put in place, largely by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s. And of course, Ronald Reagan was a Republican, right? So it comes from the right wing, but that's not to say that Bill Clinton or Barack Obama don't also embrace neoliberal policies as well. So we're thinking about economic analysis. Remember that economic analysis is part of what critical theorists do. We have to have an account of culture, which is exactly what Wendy Brown opens up her essay with, is like, how do we explain these movements in culture? And we need to couple that with an economic analysis, which is exactly what she's doing at this point in the paper, right? She is doing what we call critical theory. And because she's kind of embedded, she's internalized that partly because she's clearly read critical theorists like Marcuse, she's performing it as well. But she doesn't have the same agenda as a critical theorist that Horkheimer or Marcuse or Adorno have in the late 1930s. The discussion changes over time. The conditions change over time, right? So uh, coming back here, her next sentence here, she mentions a later person that we could throw in the critical theory camp and that we will read later on this semester. Um, uh, Foucault, Michel Foucault, he's a French intellectual and someone who theorized he like gave what the consequences of neoliberalism were. Foucault and others have taught us to grasp neoliberalism as a governing rationality, generating distinctive kinds of subjects from forms of conduct and orders of meaning and value. One of Foucault's terms for this is governmentality. What Foucault is trying to give us an account of is how, like, the external economic conditions become internalized and performed in our actual behavior and in our modes of thinking. She says, different from ideology, distortion of mystification and reality. This is like Marxian critique, right? Marx and Feuerbach are critiquing ideology. But she says, different from ideology, neoliberal rationality according to thinkers like Foucault, is productive. It's world making. It economizes every sphere of human endeavor and replaces a model of society based on justice producing social contract with society conceived and organized as markets and with states oriented by market requirements. So it's entrepreneurial. It's all about making your mark in the world. It's about affirmation and positivity. And unlike it's like if Carl Schmitt was critical of legal positivism or and as part of liberalism, neoliberal positivism is is that on steroids. So she says, as neoliberal rationality, not just economic policy, but as neoliberal rationality is performed by um, subjects within a neoliberal economy, as that rationality becomes ubiquitous and common sense, its principles not only govern through the state, but suffuse workplaces, schools, hospitals, gyms, air travel, policing, and all manner of human desire and decisions. Higher education, for example, is not only reconfigured by neoliberal rationality as an investment in human capital in the enhancement of its own future value, this transformation makes literally unintelligible the idea and practice of education as a democratic public good. The shift in university culture in the United States over the past 40 years towards more and more business models, towards a sort of defense that your academic department has to have, like a correlation between like whether or not the students you graduate have careers and what the income level is for their careers, the erosion of tenure and the hiring and firing at will in a top-down sort of manner, the uh, hiring of administrator after administrator after administrator. Every time there's a problem in the university, the answer seems to be, oh, let's hire another assistant dean. Let's hire another administrator, right? At the same time that tenure um, uh, uh, income for professors is eroded, and people who are in a situation like me, who are teaching part-time at various different places, are groping and trying to scrounge together a living on really, really horrible pay. That is the result in the university culture. Um, uh, so there isn't a sense that like what we do is we invest in our youth to create an educated nation, because an educated and citizenry who has civic values are going to uphold the values of liberal democracy. No, more and more students these days are like they can't justify the economic cost of going to school unless they can pin it directly to some sort of way to make an income and make a living, right? There's so the humanities, the ethics, the civic nature has been gutted from universities, right? It's exactly partly one of the reasons why I started the Critical Theory Center here, is because like one of my arguments is that like when you have more than 40 or 50 years of divestment in civic values and culture in our education systems, when you only focus on STEM, like math and sciences, and you don't pay humanities professors and you get rid of their funding for the humanities at most levels, maybe not at Cornell University or the Ivy Leagues who have like these massive endowments, but certainly at the urban, densely diverse state schools that I teach at, yes, like the pay that I would bring in as a professor compared to somebody, a business professor, who starts at more than six figures a year. I'm not even half of that if I were full time. I'm not full time right now. So, and even that like yearly salary has been declining in recent years in the state of Colorado as I've been looking at it. So my argument is that like what happens when you divest in all of that kind of moral civic um values-based training of the humanities, philosophy, all of literature, all of that stuff, which might be in one sense considered bourgeois or elitist. Um, when you divest that in your culture, then you divest. We don't have the ability, like our general public is not trained with any kind of sense of how to get along with each other when we disagree with each other. We have no ability to do that. We become more and more insulated, more and more marketized under neoliberalism. And then we have no recourse except to like scream at each other or fight with each other because we don't even know how to have a civil conversation anymore. um, so I agree with Wendy Brown on that particular point with respect to academia. Um, Everything in universities, she says, is affected by this. Tuition levels and budget priorities, of course, but also curricula, teaching and research practices, hiring and admissions criteria, and administrative concerns and conduct. The coordinates of ostensibly liberal democratic nations are similarly reformatted. For example, after the 2017 election, French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron uh, declared that his determination to make France a nation that uh, thinks and moves like a startup. Everything becomes like a business. Um, most of my students, even at universities, want to do something like that, right? Even some of them who are taking this class right now, as you have said, I am just taking this class to fulfill a requirement, right? On my degree and my honors program, I'm not really interested in critical theory or becoming a better thinker. I just like need this to check something else off. It's hard to get your homework done when you have that level of investment in things, especially when the reading is really difficult. But stick with it. I'm helping. I hope you can still get something out of this class. What is she asked the question, what is the specific formulation of freedom carried out by neoliberal reason? This varies somewhat across different thinkers and instantiations of neoliberalism, but some generalizations can be made. Most obviously, freedom is submitted to market meanings. It is stripped of the political valences that attach it to popular sovereignty and thus to democracy. Instead, freedom is equated wholly with the pursuit of private ends, just making money. I'm just taking this class to fulfill a requirement. I'm going to like have a startup after school. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to retire by the end before I'm 30. um, freedom is equated wholly with the pursuit of private ends. It is appropriately unregulated, and it is largely exercised to enhance the value, competitive positioning, or market share of a person or firm. Its sole political significance is negative, flourishing where politics and especially government are absent. And as neoliberal reason reconfigures freedom's meaning, subjects and objects in this way, it tarnishes the left with the opposition to freedom in the long run, or like in whole, to court, uh, not just an economy. A brief turn to the founding neoliberals will allow us to grasp this more um, precisely. So the people on the left have an opposition to this particular notion of neoliberal rationality's notion of freedom. Look at this critique in comparison to some of the earlier lectures that we've had and the way that Marx and Feuerbach had critiqued bourgeois rationality for claiming its own type of freedom, which is a false freedom, right? It's a freedom for some people who've made a lot of money to oppress other people, right? That's the false consciousness, according to an earlier version of the left's um, version of freedom. Of course, they couple that with a turn to looking at and having an account of society. But as Wendy Brown is going to suggest here, and under neoliberalism, there's a complete rejection of society. in U.S. culture, it is a revanchism, or it's revenge against the civil rights movements and gains of the 1960s by saying, as Margaret Thatcher says, although she's English, she said, there is no such thing as society. There's only individuals and their families. That's neoliberal thinking. And if we can say there's no such thing as society as a whole, there's no such thing as culture, um, everything is market, everything is privatized. It's just about making money, and competing against other people in the marketplace. Then we don't, why would we spend money on public institutions and public schools and that all of that kind of investment in the idea of something like a civic culture? Um, so she goes in here. This is basically where she goes into a history of neoliberalism. Um, uh, Again, she mentions Thatcher here, saying that Thatcher famously intoned society does not exist. Um, uh, Thatcher's intellectual lodestar, Friedrich Hayek, decried the social as a term at once mythical, incoherent, and dangerous, falsely anthropomorphizing and drawing on animism too. So the critique coming from neoliberal theorists, and that gets picked up by political leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, um, brings it into power. And through divestment and all things public, as she says here, social justice is regarded as a misguided assault on freedom, uh, uh, then is misguided, assaults freedom in spirit and in fact, and assaults traditional morality as it inevitably attempts to replace it with one group's idea of the good. Again, I characterize this in the United States anyway as revenge on the civil rights gains of the late 1960s. Um, if those civil rights gains allow more traditionally marginalized folks to come into state funded public education, then the answer becomes to defund public education, to privatize everything. If it's about following the late 1970s, for example, if it's about something like affirmative action that comes into play in the late 70s, um, it becomes dismantled, as the Supreme Court did last summer. That's a fallout of neoliberal rationality that exceeds the discussion that Wendy Brown has here, but it's just another way of pointing to the real effects here. So neoliberal um, economic policy, once it's politicized in a particular way, is going to say that any attempts to do social justice is false, right? She's building up this, just right now, she's still talking about the history of this economically. She says for Milton Friedman, the twin threats of politics to freedom rests in its inherent concentration of power, which markets disperse, and its fundamental instrument of coercion, whether by rule or dictate, while markets feature choice. Um, so, and another part of her account here is that by divesting in public civic culture, what neoliberalism does is it depoliticizes politics. It reduces politics just to like, oh, every 4 years I vote for somebody, and then there's a peaceful transition of power. But I don't participate in anything else. The rest of the time, I'm going to work, I'm trying to get ahead, I'm starting my business. Um, I'm competing against everybody else. I'm trying to work on buying my house and getting my private property and all the individual freedom. Any kind of attention to social justice then is going to be antithetical to my need to invest in myself as an individual and only take care of myself and my family. Um, uh, um, so going on here, politics is gutted of a more robust account of what it means, certainly in an Aristotelian virtue ethics, or why we might want to behave um, with tolerance towards our neighbors or something like that. The morality is gutted from politics, especially if it's tied in any way to social justice. So, although he acknowledges that some measure of political power is indispensable for state or for stable, secure societies, and even for the existence of health of markets, for Friedman, every political act, rule, or mandate is a subtraction from individual freedom. So this is the radicalized notion of individual freedom under neoliberal rationality. Um, he says even direct democracy, whenever it falls short of unanimity, compromises freedom as it imposes the will of the majority on the minority. Um, Interesting sort of take there again, if you go back to my Lenin lectures and the ways that Lenin was categorizing democracy. Markets, by contrast, always allow individual preferences to prevail, the equivalent of always getting what one votes for rather than having to submit to majorities. So she's articulating how what gets developed is a resentment towards the democratic control as well. And this is, of course, where neoliberal economic policy is paving the way for anti-liberal or so not just anti-liberal, anti-democratic attitudes, right? So there's a parting of the ways between liberalism and democracy, which some, I think, political scientists will say has always been in tension. But what neoliberalism does in breaking them apart is it becomes anti-democratic. And perhaps, if some people might say anti-liberal as well too, but definitely anti-democratic. Long quote, Friedrich Hayek, she comes back into here, and she stresses again that the way that this was set up in the late 1930s was that it was meant to ward off National Socialism or fascism or totalitarianism as the Americans saw it, what was happening in the Far East, although Hayek is not necessarily American. So some of the thinkers are coming out of like um, uh, or Yugoslavia or Czech Republic or Austria, or like that kind of um, part of Europe, but they end up all at the University of Chicago School of Economics. And so we have Keynesian economics that are happening in the 1950s. I can't go into that too much right now. Or John Kenneth Galbraith's book, The Affluent Society, is one of the um, uh, economic policies from in there. And Keynesianism wants to support um, uh, public goods. And so neoliberalism comes at a time where that economic kind of conditioning is falling out of favor. It also comes, and this is another thing I think that Noam Chomsky has brought up before, neoliberalism really starts taking off in the early 1970s as the United States shifts away from a gold standard and becomes a economy based on finance capital. We get the rise of credit cards, credit agencies, virtual wealth is another way of thinking about it, where we're just leveraging imaginary sorts of credit um, uh, accounts or like credit scores and the amount of credit that we have that's not being used that then tells you whether or not you're a good person or not because everything has become economically driven. Uh, Not the way that Brown is talking about it here, but she's talking about Hayek. She says for Hayek, liberty prevails where there is no intentional human coercion. It is restricted only by enforced rules, dictates, or threats. Freedom or liberty, which he uses interchangeably, is nothing more than an independence of the arbitrary will of another. It refers solely to a relation of men to other men, and the only infringement on it is coercion by men. Hayek explicitly rejects every other meaning of freedom and is especially hostile to meanings that flirt with the capacity or power to act or freedom to. or that equate freedom with popular sovereignty. This is another way to think about it. Think back to Levinas's essay in the last lecture. Levinas, in a different way than the Marxian folks, is saying that there's something that happens with enlightenment or bourgeois rationality that guts a deeper moral sense of freedom, the freedom that he characterizes as actually coming from Christianity at that point in his essay. Uh, if we return to Hayek, what Wendy Brown is saying about Hayek is that there's an extension of that. There is this more and more abstract notion of freedom, and it becomes freedom to just do whatever I want whenever I want, right? It's completely unbound to any kind of moral or ethical obligation. It's completely economic in this sense. Uh, and so there's just a sort of parallel there. I think that Brown is pointing out with Hayek. She says Hayek considers these not merely wrong freedoms, but dangerous. So this idea that freedom, like in its earlier sense of liberalism, like if we look at the word, it's like a freedom from, right? Maybe it's a freedom from authoritarian control of a monarch, or in a secularized form, it's a freedom from the ideological or dogmatic control of the church. And the liberal nation state creates a new kind of situation and of social relations that are not based on religious dogma, for example, right? That classic notion of freedom is freedom from something that might constrain me. But over that next several centuries, it becomes positivistic in the sense that it becomes freedom to do something, freedom, uh, free access to clean water, free access to healthcare, the right to citizenship in a country. All of these things that are listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations in 1948 after World War II, right? So Hayek has been developing neoliberal policy in the late 30s and early 40s that is antithetical to like half of the kind of rights that are said to be universal after World War II by the United Nations. So that's interesting. And I think that that's not what part of Wendy Brown's analysis here, but I think that that lends itself towards the nationalism that's going to coalesce under neoliberal policies. The nationalism that's going to inform somebody like Donald Trump to say like make America great again, right? Even though what Hayek thinks he's doing is pushing away against nationalism by opening up marketability and creating something like global free trade or something like that, where we like don't have markets just tied to nationalism. What his idea of freedom here does, by ejecting any kind of positive notion of freedom to do something, ends up gutting the civic culture that holds something together through depoliticization, is what Wendy Brown is saying here. Let me just skip down a few paragraphs here. I'm assuming you've read this on your own. I don't need to read the whole thing. She talks about Adam Smith. She says, liberty, by contrast, generates a kind of secular intelligent design when it is disciplined by the competition that responsibilizes liberty's use. The root principle may be familiar from Adam Smith, and this might be something like the invisible hand, but Hayek has significantly modified it and expanded its view. So again, she's qualifying what would be about neoliberalism versus somebody, a classic liberal like Adam Smith. She says, as Foucault notes, the modification replaces exchange with competition and the engine of spontaneous order and development, and thus requires that competition be installed in every domain and instilled in every subject. So this is, again, what makes neoliberalism different than classic liberalism, according to Foucault, is that, yeah, classical liberalism or laissez-faire capitalism is about exchange, but neoliberalism puts all human life into market conditions and then says compete with each other. And you are only an individual and society doesn't exist. And so all you should do is compete against everybody else. And if you lose, it's because you're bad in some sort of way, right? So morality comes in here. Although she will have some interesting things to say about Hayek and the original thinkers, they associate their liberalism with a kind of Christianity, right? With so like somehow Christian values that they think that that's what's going to happen. But again, in the Frankenstein monster sense, what comes to bite them in the ass is that a new, completely competitive market-based culture has divested itself in all things ethical, and everything becomes brute competition. Um, uh, there might be some people in society that want to hold on to some sort of like aspect of um, Christianity and moral values, and they would, and then they agree, and then they attach that Christianity to neoliberal policies, and from that we get the formation of the Christian right in the United States. So that's the fusion of the Christian right that happens in the late 1970s that brings Ronald Reagan into power. Ronald Reagan introduces all of these neoliberal economic policies, and so that's where that kind of connection to the Christian right is going to come into play here. Um, at some point in this essay, I can't remember where it is right now, Wendy Brown talks about the statistics of white Christian evangelicals who only like 28% of them or something like that with when Obama is in office say that if an elected official does something immoral, they can stay in office. But after Trump gets elected, 72% or something, early 70s, after say that it's okay for an elected official to commit immoral acts and to stay in power, right? So there's that shift in power even among the so-called value-laden Christian evangelicals or white Christian evangelicals, as people are using it now. Again, in my own thinking, Euro-Christian worldview permeates and exists beneath liberalism itself in the classic sense. And then, of course, I don't see much of a contradiction in the way that Hayek and even the so-called white Christian evangelicals are embracing their notion of neoliberalism, which becomes a form of domination and imperialism, right? That to me is part of the Euro-Christian worldview going way back. And so I align a little bit with Levinas's view. But there is a sense that I think Wendy Brown is right here that if we divest in a kind of civic culture, then like what is left of Christianity in just a kind of ethical or moral sense? And I definitely know, um, like believing Christians who live in the middle of Nebraska, right? Who are consider themselves conservative and in a value sort of way, who don't believe that they can vote for somebody like Donald Trump because he's not a Christian. He's so clearly not a Christian. So I want to hold space for some of my conservative Christian friends, family members that like don't live in cities that would not necessarily embrace MAGA Republicans or MAGA Trumps. That's so that it's not to say that all Christian values have gone away, but whatever this the embrace of white evangelicals who have helped to bring Trump to power, as Wendy Brown opens the essay with, that's a different kind of phenomenon. And there are lots of books like Gorski's book. What's that his name? Peter Gorski. There's a white evangelical Christianity. There's a lot of books coming out on that notion right now. It's not to say that all evangelical Christians are MAGA Republicans, just and I'm saying that as a non-Christian myself. So be careful about casting all people of faith into one category. Um, in the United States, she says here, as neoliberal rationality has widened and deepened its hold, this abstract principle of securing personal freedom against the presumed coerciveness of political life including but not limited to the state, has unfolded concretely in both legislation and popular discourse. It's widely mobilized by the right to challenge norms of equality, tolerance, and inclusion in the name of freedom and choice. It's been deployed by the Supreme Court majority to enhance the power of corporations and to monopolize and manipulate even ever larger parts of political life while permitting them to enjoy ever greater protection from political regulation and mandates, thereby converting neoliberal plutonomy, which is control of society by the rich, right, um, into novel depoliticized forms of plutocracy. Or plutocracy here being the control of the rich by the rich, not a democracy, right? Not the control of the people. So again, privatization, she is going to now shift to see how when we depoliticize this stuff, what we get is that revenge on social justice. We get that intolerance to any kind of discussion that happens in many universities, which is the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example, right? This is like a big discourse in current universities that at the same time they're becoming neoliberalized. There's been this kind of attention to try and focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But even that in university culture becomes a form of competition. Like, I'm more anti-racist than you are in your class. Like, I've seen this among professors, right? And because I'm more anti-racist, that should give me more power. Where it's like, can we not have the value of being anti-racist across the board and proceed from there? No, because we have like the people who are competing amongst each other about who's more committed to that kind of thing. And then you have the socioeconomic forces of neoliberalism coming and saying like, look, you guys can't even agree with each other. What we really need is a new dean to come in and just like fire you all and just hire you and fire you like we're a corporation. That's what's happening in universities if you're not on and not just one university. It's like happening across lots of universities, and it depends on your state, right? I live in the state of Colorado that is ranks 47th in the nation in what we spend on higher education, right? So the discussions here in Colorado are different than like the massive kinds of arguments that are going on in California that used to have almost a free higher education kind of system back in the early 70s, which was very committed to the public good. And so professor salaries in California, it's related, but it's a different economic situation than somebody like me who's teaching in Colorado. Okay. This political form of privatization, however, does more than challenge principles of practices of equality and anti-discrimination by expanding individual rights for persons or extending them to corporations. Expanding, quote, personal protected sphere is also a means of ushering family values, ordinances, and claims into public spaces heretofore organized by democratic law and means. By this means, the social and public are not only economized, but familialized by neoliberalism. Together, these challenge the principles of equality, secularism, pluralism, and inclusion at the heart of modern democratic society, allowing them to be replaced by what Hayek termed the traditional moral values of the personal protected sphere. This is where that Euro-Christian element is part of Hayek's original thinking. There is a moral side to the way that he thinks of things. That would be the moral side that embraces in the 1950s becomes something like McCarthyism, right? That's like we've got to fight godless communism, right? And so we take on this kind of Christian identity culture, although the particular movement, Christian identity, is a white supremacist movement, right? So I'm just talking about maybe lowercase Christian identity or something, but there's a movement out there that comes very much from this kind of particular moment in history of kind of a fundamentalist movement that it calls itself Christian identity that is overtly white supremacist. So family values becomes part and parcel of this kind of thing, and that's why we might see it with Jerry Falwell and the rise of the Christian right in the late 70s and early 80s. So it does appear to have this kind of moral quality to it. As she goes on here, she says, consider in this regard the campaign now 3 decades old to replace public funding in education with systems of individual vouchers and permit families to choose schools for their children that comport closely with their moral values and to escape schools that do not, or consider court rulings permitting businesses to escape federal equality mandates on the basis of religious belief as they withhold employee health insurance coverage for forms of contraception deemed abortifacients, um, things that enable abortions, or refuse custom from LGBT people seeking to marry, or consider the increasing open identification of Western nations with Christianity as and centrist, as well as conservative political discourse, and the compromise of a secular public sphere that this identification entails. In short, expanding the personal protected sphere and curtailing the reach of democracy in the name of freedom develops as a new ethos of the nation, one that replaces the public pluralistic secular democratic national imaginary with a private homogenous and familial one. So again, this is this characterization of neoliberalism. A difference between me, which you don't have to accept my reading of this, but because I see liberalism as coming out of Euro-Christian worldview, I see these more extreme forms of it, whether we call it neoliberalism or the embracing of a kind of Christian nation state by the white evangelicals, as the logical outgrowth of a kind of imperialism that is burned into Euro-Christian culture after it becomes aligned with Rome and the Empire of Rome. So that's what makes Euro-Christian different from like just Christian in general. I don't think Coptic Christians in Egypt are Euro-Christians, for example. Um, Certainly not, the earlier Christians are not Euro Christians. It's only after the church moves to Rome, and it takes a few hundred years, and Christianity separates from Judaism, all of that kind of ancient world stuff. My thinking is just happens to have a longer sort of historical thing in mind, and that's why I think Levinas's essay was important for us in this class. Whatever this new version of Christianity is, it maybe is not the same sort of thing as the old world too. So I think that is something to be said for the ways that Marx and Feuerbach characterize Christianity as becoming ideological under bourgeois capitalism. I think that there's a lot to be said about that kind of stuff as well. Um, the fundamentalist movement, for example, it only happens at the end of the 18th century or something. Gosh, it only happens at the end of the 1800s, at the end of the 19th century, when we've had this turn to biblical scholarship in Germany, a lot of turn towards historicism in Germany, and then the fundamentalist Christian movement has to arise to reclaim what it considers to be some sort of values that are lost. It's a nostalgic movement to begin with. And it's definitely what Nietzsche would call ressentiment, that we've noticed that we've lost something and now we need to reclaim it. But that reclamation process only comes from a break or a loss. It doesn't actually get you back to what the disciples were thinking right after Christ or something like that. Um, uh, and that's not to say the fundamentalist movement, of course, has different forms and of evolution. So fundamentalism is not the same thing as white evangelical Christianity. Just to let you know, I have a religious studies background, and this stuff is meaningful to me. Um, but many sort of conventional secularized liberals would say, like, well, if there's something, backwards about anybody who has kind of religion, or that they believe in the separation of church and state, for example, as a fundamental secular Enlightenment value. For me, the broader sort of trajectory of liberalism itself maintains a Euro-Christian worldview, like all lowercase, even if it doesn't claim faith, it still sees the world in a particular way, and therefore global capitalism works in line with this. Benjamin Friedman, who's an economist at Harvard, I believe, or maybe his book's just Harvard University Press, has a recent book called Religion and Capitalism. So a lot of economists have been talking about economy in terms of faith lately as well. It's just a broader discourse than what Brown is talking about here. Um, so she says we must avoid being blinded by the language of rights here. Rights attached to individuals, which is classic liberalism, right, are the flying wedge with which democratic commitments to equality, civility, and inclusion, or social justice, are challenged by neoliberal reason, instantiated as jurisprudence or public policy, or wielded by alt-right activists under the banner of free speech. So the forces behind them, however, which stage incursions into the public space and pushes back against political and democratic spaces, are the values and the claims of the market on the one hand, and the heteropatriarchal Christian familialism on the other. In each case, rights are strategically redeployed from their intended attachment to individuals to something else. We remove rights from individuals and we start giving them to corporations, to property, to capital, to families, to churches, to whiteness itself. Economic and familial privatization of the public combined with the neoliberal denigration of the social together build the right-wing attack on social justice and create this perspective that social justice is somehow tyrannical and fascist. That's that moment where you have a democratic impulse towards social justice that has been refigured under neoliberalism to be described as if it were anti-democratic, as if it were tyrannical, as if it were fascist even. And so we see this in recent kind of right-wing thinkers who are lamenting the downfall of liberalism itself, like Patrick Deneen would be one of these types of characters. I'll think of another one I wrote a piece about. Mark Lila has a book recently about the lamentation of the implosion of liberalism that comes from these thinkers who are saying that what has happened to universities or something, and their increasing emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that has become its own sort of form of fascism. So the charge of fascism that way. Wendy Brown is taking a different tack, and she's saying, no, the reason why people are making those kinds of arguments is because they have embraced neoliberal rationality, which has inverted democratic policies of inclusion and tolerance, and is now calling it tyrannical. So again, for me, for Roger Green anyway, this is one of those moments that I would call a part of the political theological vortex, where we're seeing a shift in positioning, and then the finger blaming of fascism coming by people who identify as being on the right against the left, and people as being on the left against the right, and people can't quite decide, and that's why we needed to go in this particular course to so many early lecturers and to really think about what the rise of fascism was and why critical theory arose as a discourse in the midst of that, and why it must maintain a critical attitude even in liberal democracy, because neoliberalism itself has become its own form of fascism, right? So I know this is like really heady stuff to be thinking about, but we needed the longer history in this intro course if we're going to understand what it might mean to do something like critical theory today. So again, going on here, this is where Wendy Brown is going to say that at this point, it's easy to see how sometimes viciously sexist, transphobic, xenophobic, and racist speech and conduct have erupted as expressions of freedom, challenging the dictates of, quote, political correctness. When the protected personal sphere is extended, when opposition to restriction and regulation becomes a foundational and universal principle, when the social is demeaned and the political is demonized, individual animus and the historical powers of white male dominance are both unleashed and legitimated. No one owes anything to anyone or has the right to restrict anything in anyone. Equality, as Hayek bluntly declared, is but the language of envy. Meanwhile, left opposition to supremacist sentiment is cast as tyrannical, policing, or rooted in the totalitarian mythos of the social and drawing on coercive powers of the political. The effect is to profoundly reframe and not just reignite the culture wars once imagined to have peaked at the end of the 20th century. And then she has this nice qualification paragraph here, and she says, I want to be really clear that like Hayek didn't mean, the original thinkers didn't mean for neoliberalism to have this turn. It was set up to prevent fascism, right? But its unintended effects, depoliticizing the public sphere and marketizing everything, is that first of all, it had horrible effects on people's social income, including white males, whose livelihood has become diminished, right? But uh, marginalized folks have been living in horrible conditions to begin with too. So it's like people it knows no, like neoliberalism knows no race in the sense that like it just fucks over anybody um uh uh um economically, and especially if you're in the lower middle classes, it just says that if you're not rich, it's your own fault, right? When there's no public recourse to welfare conditions to help you get back on your feet because you were already immorally incapable of generating your own wealth in the way it should be done in a neoliberal, rational sort of culture here. So it does come to bite the neoliberals in the ass in terms of its gutting of the democratic democracy altogether, right? So she's saying, I'm not claiming that Hayek or the neoliberals imagined or even advocated the strikingly disinhibited attacks on immigrants, Muslims, blacks, Jews, queers, and women from an emboldened and growing radical right today. Rather, the point is that these developments are, in fact, are part effects of neoliberal reason, its expansion of the domain and claim of the private for persons and corporations alike, and its rejection of political and social justice. Um, so the result of this revanchism, this like revenge against the social justice gains of the 1960s, is that gives especially white men who see that come to see that immigrants or that historically marginalized folks are getting gains. They're getting access to something while the so-called white male has lost a status or lost privilege and lost supremacy. And so that allows for a kind of resentment and anger and rage to come forth, right? And the rage is directed especially at immigrants. And then especially at anybody who wants to claim some kind of social justice, whether it's in terms of race or gender, sexual orientation, you name it. If it's social justice, it's just another thing that is taking away um, the privileges that should have been that are owed in the kind of this white male psychology as Wendy Brown is describing it. I will just say, I identify as a Euro-Christian male. I don't use the term white, but yeah, people on the street, yeah, can say I'm a white male, and I don't have any kind of a problem with Wendy Brown's analysis about this, nor do I feel the need or the rage that some of the ways that white males are being discussed here. Although I definitely see that phenomenon, right? So I think she's right on in addressing like the logic of some of this. So she says, moreover, the social and attack on the political, along with a broad discrediting of democratic norms, fueled and legitimated energies emanating from an entirely different set of concrete neoliberal effects, namely the declining sovereignty and security of men, whites, Christianity, and nation states. These energies for aggrieved power are expressed variously in rancorous rage and acting out, but also quiet voting for far-right candidates. And they target a range of objects, which are politicians, liberal elites, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, queers, blacks, but they would not have a legitimate political form in a liberal or social democratic order, which is why they maintained um, why they remained on the political fringe until recent years. So neoliberal reasons assault on egalitarianism and social provision, social justice, politics, and democracy, along with its extension of the personal protected sphere, has given them a new legitimate form. We are thus dealing with what Stuart Hall would call a conjuncture, or what Michel Foucault would term a contingent genealogical formation. Stuart Hall is a Caribbean and English or British thinker associated with cultural theory as it emerges. If you know, my organization is called the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. Stuart Hall is going to be part of a later kind of movement that says that we have to take seriously what the earlier critical theorists say, and we have to take culture into account. And when we take culture into account, we can't just have it be Euro-Christian or white European culture. We have to take culture into account from the global South or from the Caribbean and things like that, right? From post-colonialism that comes in there. We'll talk about that in later when we get to Fanon and later thinkers in this particular class. I'm going to skip down just for time through this section, except to this last paragraph, right? Because she's describing how things have come to be. She says, when the nation itself is economized and familialized in this way, democratic principles of universality, equality, and openness are jettisoned, and the nation becomes legitimately illiberal towards those designated as aversive insiders and invading outsiders. Statism, policing, and authoritarian power also ramify since walling, policing, and securitization of every kind are authorized by the need to secure the vast expanse of personal deregulated freedom. Security is not what guarantees or limits freedom, rather, walls, gates, security systems, and no trespassing signs become freedom's signifiers as they demarcate the private from the public, the protected from the open, the familiar from the strange, the owned from the common. Democratic procedure and legitimacy are also displaced by the values of the family and the market, the not negotiation, deliberation, or even the rule of law, but diktat is the basis of household authority, and force is how it legitimately defends itself against invading outsiders. Securing a vast expanse of private and deregulated freedom thus inaugurates new spaces and valorizations of policing, authority, securitization, the need for which it is intensified by disinhibited social energies we shall consider shortly. Et voila, 21st century authoritarianism is uh, 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 you know, promoted in freedom's name, right? And so that's how we get to this particular moment. So she's describing the present moment. What does critical theory do? It takes the social into account. It takes economics into account. It is a critique of individuated rationality, the critique of neoliberal rationality, combined with economic analysis geared toward a analysis of the contemporary, an analysis of the present, how the present conditions are different from the past. So we've gotten history and the forces of history here, and even the conflicting forces of history. This is all classic methodology for critical theory that Wendy Brown is doing as a writer. Then she goes on in the next section to talk about the energies of right-wing freedom and nationalism. She says there's a whole logic to this. We've been considering the logic of governing reason, but not the affective or emotional energies giving shape and content to contemporary rightist politics and expressions. Neoliberalism by itself, including its rollout in law and policy and its interpolation of subjects, does not by itself anyway, generate nationalistic movements hell-bent on whitening nations, walling out immigrants or refugees, or vilifying feminists, queers, liberals, leftists, intellectuals, and even mainstream journalists, nor does it incite the rancorous rage and other antisocial passions or pop the lid on the worst of human nature, masculinity or whiteness. Here, what's important then to give an account of this, she says, is not the broad shifts occasioned by neoliberal reason outlined above, but neoliberal economic policy effects in specific historical social contexts, especially those trammeling white, middle class, or working class existence in rural and suburban regions of Euro-Atlantic nations. Then she goes on and reprises she says that we're going to reprise the familiar. She's going to extend this to the global north. And what she's accounting for, at least in terms of the way I've been teaching this class right now, is now we've accounted for the logic of the economic rationality and the policies and the way that that depoliticizes things, but she starts giving an account of the irrational, at least in a classic Western, hierarchy of reason kind of fashion. Now she's giving an account for the irrational. Remember, this is something that critical theorists tried to move towards, especially after the 1920s. How do we account for the irrational? How do we account for rage? She says, it's not only white working and middle class men that are uniquely injured by neoliberal policy and uniquely neglected neoliberal politicians, as I said earlier. The problem is that they feel like something that they had, a supremacy or privileges that they had, have been taken away from them, and that now other people, immigrants or non-whites, are advocating and sometimes somehow getting something that they weren't in line for. Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, who's also at Berkeley, has a good book on this. And I'll think of the name of it in just a second. But she has a good metaphor for this, where she says that it's almost like these people believe in the American dream, and they believe that they've been standing in line waiting to get the wealth that is promised by the American dream. And these other people, the sort of white masculine folks as characterized here, but not just only male folks, but rural whites, often in the way that this is being figured here, might fall into this category. And Hochschild's book is set as an ethnography of people in rural Louisiana. They see themselves as having been waiting in line for something that's not coming to them, and other people cutting in line in front of them. That's another way of explaining this kind of resentment that develops among our lower and middle class whites. Of course, Hillary Clinton called these people deplorables, and that of course enraged them more, right? She says, Wendy Brown doesn't talk about that with Hillary Clinton here, but she does mention Clinton. She says, it's a mistake to see white working and middle class men as uniquely injured by neoliberal policy and uniquely neglected by neoliberal politicians. This common reproach of the Hillary Clinton campaign by mainstream liberal pundits that it focused too much on identity politics and gave short shrift to the white working stiff, misses the extent to which the displacement it suffered by whites, especially white men, is not mainly experienced as economic decline, but as lost entitlement to politically, socially, and economically reproduced supremacism, and why, therefore, right-wing and plutocratic politicians can get away with doing nothing substantive for their constituencies as long as they verbally anoint their wounds with anti-immigrant, anti-black, or anti-globalization rhetoric, and as long as they realign the figure and voice of the nation with the figure and voice of nativism. So what the politicians and the neoliberal sort of and right-wing camp do is they foster this rage among their constituencies and says, yeah, it's like these border crossers, these criminals that are coming from Mexico, you name it. It's the Muslim immigrants. Look at all of the free things that they're getting. Um, and you're not getting that, and that fuels the rage, but they don't actually make any kind of policies that help white middle and working class men or rural white or poor white folks. Like it doesn't. So they capitalize on the kind of identity politics of claims to white supremacy or nostalgic claims to white supremacy, while doing nothing for those actual people. And so Wendy Brown is saying that like it is not to say that that poor and working class, like middle class and working class whites are screwed by neoliberal economy. They are angry, and they should be angry. But what has happened is this rhetoric has come in that says that they have lost something that was a privileged and guaranteed kind of status that they had, and other people who are not white are coming in and getting the thing that getting the promises that they should have had by heredity, by right, by living here. Of course, there's this like no kind of account in this kind of rhetoric for the fact that they are colonizers to indigenous people in this nation, right? That white or Euro-Christian folks are all colonizers, and so there's a lack of historical memory on that front, as my native colleagues are quick to point out. And this is why we will look at Glenn Sean Coulthard next, and why I think some of the best critical theory coming out today really does come from indigenous folks. So the name for this, as she returns to Nietzsche here, is ressentiment. Um, and she gives a gloss of Nietzsche and nihilism in the 19th century, as we've talked about at different times in lectures. And says Nietzsche is the first person to really give a philosopher anyway to give an account of the way that resentment builds a kind of moral outrage against the people, that it sees as gaining power over itself when it has lost power. And this is then becomes a critique of Western Judeo-Christian values. She brings that into the present, talking about Obama. And this is that part of the essay, right, that I was referring to earlier, that where she says that in 2011, a survey showed that conservatives felt like, she says, what's the percent here? In 2011, during the Obama presidency, only 30%, I said late 20s, 30% of the white evangelical Protestants believed that an elected official who commits an immoral act in his or her personal life can still be ethical in public life. But that changes to 64% once Trump is elected, because Trump is openly ragey and he's openly immoral. He like grabs women's private parts. I mean, he's now been, you know, he is now legally a sex offender, right? And in court, at least at this point in time of reading this, he has lost cases, right, of sexual assault. So this shows like that even among so-called evangelical Christians, they don't seem to care that Trump acts immorally, because they've embraced this kind of neoliberal um, rationality. She says here, I've highlighted, combined with the disparagement and the depletion of social freedom becomes doing or saying what one likes without regard for its effects, freedom to be genuinely without care and predicaments, vulnerabilities, or fates and of other humans, other species of the planet. So the more ragey, the more outrageous you can be, the more of an F off, screw off attitude that you can have, the more directly offensive that you can be. It emboldens the white rage. It offends the people on the left who are wanting this kind of politics of respectability. But every time they try to present politics of respectability or tolerance or diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's anathema to the people on the right. And so it becomes a sort of feedback cycle of just rage politics, right? And then every time one is doing something, no matter how gross, no matter how masculinist or sexist or racist it happens to be, it just becomes an enacting of one's freedom. And they do it, and they, because it's an enaction of their freedom, when other people are offended, it's a sense of source of pride for people on the MAGA Republican sort of right wing or the far right, uh, folks like the Proud Boys or something like that, where they're embracing, their masculine white supremacy, and or even the people who are claiming that they're unapologetically masculine, transgender doesn't exist, that kind of stuff. So the reaffirmation of binary heteronormative gender categories and sexual orientation categories. Any kind of attempt to think about gender as a socially constructed thing as just part of that whole impulse towards social justice, right? So the more that you can attack it, the more you can seem intolerant of LGBTQIA issues. That again emboldens the rage and rancor that comes from resentment among white masculinity or just white folks in general, because it's not only white masculine folks. Like when I've seen it happen with my students over the years, especially with Trump, it was mostly young white women who were really, really emboldened to say things in classrooms and to embrace Trumpism, at least in the campuses that I taught in. A largely diverse working class schools. In private schools where I've taught in Denver, the big private school that I've taught at, there is definitely a culture of MAGA Republicans, some young white men who've been overtly anti-Semitic lately. A lot of trouble with that on campus, and overtly racist and overtly sexist. Um, uh, so she sums up this next section here. Freedom abandons all affinity with political self-determination found in Rousseau, Tocqueville, or Marx. It departs the categorical imperative from Kant. It's untethered from Mill's cultivation of individuality and advancement of civilization. It even leaves behind Jeremy Bentham's binding of liberty to the calculation of utility and maximization. All of this would be classic liberalism. Instead, the nihilistic disintegration of ethical values combined with neoliberalism's assault on the social and the unleashing of the far right, of the right, and the power of the personal generates a freedom that is furious, passionate, and destructive, symptomizing ethical destitution, even as it sometimes dresses in conservative righteousness. The freedom is paradoxically expressed as nihilism and against nihilism. Somebody will say, like, I am anti-nihilist because I'm affirming my white masculinity. I'm affirming my evangelical Christianity. I want to return us to kinds of values, but this is actually produced in the nihilism of ressentiment, as described by Friedrich Nietzsche. It's a freedom, unbridled and uncultured freedom to put a stick in the eye of accepted norms, freedom from care of the morrow, joyous in the provocations and animated by aggrieved, vengeful reactions against those it holds responsible for its suffering or displacement. It is the freedom of I will because I can, and I can because I am nothing. I believe in nothing, and the world has become nothing. This is the freedom remaindered by nihilism in the making for centuries and embodied in neoliberal reason itself, which posits no value apart from that generated by price and speculative markets. And here's a point where I think Wendy Brown is nodding to like what I said earlier about, and my thinking about like a longer arc to Euro-Christian worldview and its impact on the world through capitalism and liberalism, and then later neoliberalism. Um, she's saying that, yeah, this has been in the making for centuries. When we look at like the way that like, Marx had claimed that like that rationality under the Enlightenment had become hollowed out. So there is this longer process of rationality and being bound to this very more and more abstract notion of freedom that is completely disattached to any kind of ethical value. Of course, again, that's another reason why I had us read the Levinas piece. So in the last section of her essay, she returns to Herbert Marcuse. We're going to read Marcuse's essay and his our idea of repressive desublimation. She gives a brief account of it here. I'm not going to do a whole account of it because this lecture has gone on for a while here, but I'm going to point out a few things with my highlights here. She says what Marcuse famously termed repressive desublimation occurs within an order of capitalist domination, exploitation, and false needs as technology reduces the demands of necessity and desire is everywhere incorporated into a commodity culture enjoyed by a growing middle class. As we turn back to the critical theorists of the 40s who have turned their attention to mass culture and consumer society, we will see this in more depth in coming weeks in our course here. But what Marcuse comes up with in the 50s, especially in his first book, Eros and Civilization, he's combined Freud, as I've given attention to in earlier lectures, in an attempt to try and give an account of the irrational along with the economic. And what he comes up with is this idea of repressive desublimation. And so what he says is that consumer society gives us the illusion of choice. Like I can go to the supermarket and I can have like an entire aisle of different kinds of cereal, and that gives the illusion of choice. But what I've really become is the slave to that kind of market system. And what develops from this is a sense of false needs. Along with this, part of culture is it's sexualized too, right? So sex sells, as we know, and in consumer society, the idea of sex as libidinous in Freud's term, that like what we have sex to perpetuate the species, that's what the libido is. So sex becomes something that becomes materialized and bought and sold. In this particular culture as well. And that says that we can have whatever we want whenever we want to have it. So that's where desublimation, like in a classic society that might have like a super ego type of moral structure, a society that is deeply consumerist says like, screw all that, you can have whatever you want whenever you want. And so it claims that it's giving you freedom, but what actually the result of that is, so that's desublimation, right? It's like you can like do whatever you want, like take a day for yourself, focus on the ego, like sex, have sex however you want. Like the materialization of this then becomes seems like it's liberatory at the beginning, and like lots of 60s, the sexual liberation culture of the 1960s thought that it was desublimating, right? But what Marcuse is saying is that over time in that kind of culture, what happens is that your idea of choice and freedom all of the time becomes its own form of repression as corporations take over, as everything becomes monetized, and your emancipation is only tied to your economic ability, then we don't have human relationships anymore, including sexual ones. We have been gutted by all of the things that might make it have made it worthwhile in the past. So it might be a little bit tied to a loss of traditional values in some ways. I could see it that way too, but that's not exactly the tack that Marcuse is taking. Marcuse, as she says, returns to Hegel and the idea of the happy consciousness. The happy consciousness is the one in Hegelian thought that becomes in line with the society, and Hegel, the state is a Christianizing force. It's a moralizing force. And Feuerbach and Marx, they see that that moralizing force is just ideology, and so they do materialism. Marcuse says that, and of course, Marcuse did his dissertation under Heidegger on Hegel. He says loss of consciousness due to the satisfactory liberties granted by an unfree society makes for a happy consciousness which facilitates acceptance in the misdeeds of the society. The loss of conscience is then a token of declining autonomy and comprehension. So he says that what this does is the society that says you can have whatever you want, you can eat whatever you want, you can have access to like all of the candy and cheap sugar and all these sorts of things. What it does is it creates anti-intellectuals who don't feel like they have to do any thinking for themselves. That creates a resentment of actual intellectuals who become the liberal elites. And that over time, what happens is that like you have this sense of freedom. I can do whatever I want whenever I want. Don't tell me what to do. Like, don't tell me how to talk, be politically correct, any of that kind of stuff. It's just a complete rejection of all things, not only moral, but also intellectual. And it becomes a cheapened version of freedom. And what happens over time, she says for Marcuse, is that autonomy declines when comprehension declines. So we become less able to even make conscious or intellectual decisions. Um, um, and she does point out that this is kind of maybe a rationalist part of Marcuse, maybe so. That what happens over time is economy declines when comprehension declines, and comprehension declines when it is not required for survival, and when the unemancipated subject is steeped in capitalist commodity pleasures and stimulus. Put it the other way around, the instinctual repression takes work, including the work of the intellect. Marcuse writes a whole big book about this called One-Dimensional Society or One-Dimensional Man in the 1960s. We'll look at some of that stuff later on. Repressive desublimation, Marcuse suggests, is part and parcel of a society which happens, but nowhere its negation. It looks like freedom while shoring up the status quo and submitting to it. Its expressions, Marcuse says, may be bold or vulgar, even enough even to appear as maverick or dissident. It may be wild and obscene, virile and tasty, quite immoral. And so this is what becomes a separation, because in the late 60s in psychedelic culture, and that was what my earlier book was on, there is this idea that we've emancipated ourselves from Freud, death to the death drive, as they said, that we've had this emancipatory culture, and they attributed it to Marcuse, right? And some of the things that he said in his thinking. But what Marcuse says is that actually, as that movement becomes the mass movements of the late 1960s, it's not fulfilling the critical theory promise. It ends up becoming a version of repressive desublimation. Although intellectuals in the leftist movement, like Abby Hoffman, for sure, who's a student of Marcuse, Angela Davis, who's a student of Marcuse, have a much more sophisticated take on some of this stuff. So I just can't go into that today because it's 1960s and I wrote a whole book on it. Most importantly, says Wendy Brown, for our purposes here, Marcuse's insight is suggestive for understanding the quantity and intensity of aggression spilling out from the right, especially the alt-right, amidst the frenzied affirmation of individual freedom. That really what neoliberal rationality and neoliberal and consumer culture did was it helped create the means by which really restrictive alt-right, racist, white supremacist sorts of anti-gay, anti-queer attitudes that were once on the margins. It's opened the floodgates for that to come into mainstream culture, unapologetically immoral, unapologetically disgusting, unapologetically sexist, unapologetically racist. And because that what it is it's that is the de-sublimation that actually appears to these people on the alt-right as like, I'm just being my freedom. I can say whatever the fuck I want whenever I say it. I can, I'm a man and I'm proud of my masculinity. All of that is framed in terms of freedom, but what it is anti-intellectual, and it is a form of unfreedom. So it's repressive in other ways. It's certainly anti-democratic, and it allows for the undoing of the demos, is what she calls it in a book of the same title. So maybe I'll get this like about the last big highlight here. Wendy Brown says much of this is the inadvertent rather than intended progeny of neoliberal intellectuals. Again, they didn't intend it to begin with. They dreamed of nations comprised of free individuals lightly restrained by the rule of law, guided by moral and market values of conduct and disciplined by competition. But just as Marxism's fatal flaw was its neglect of the enduring complexities of political power, the neoliberal dream has inverted into its own nightmare, authoritarian political culture supported by angry myth-mongering masses. So here she has critiqued Marx. She is not Marxist in the classic sense. If we're going to claim, like people on the right oftentimes want to do, that if we're doing critical theory, we're just Marxists, no. Wendy Brown, even more than the classic Frankfurt School theorists, are going to say Marx really missed out on not just an account of culture, but an account of politics itself, which he dismissed as part of the superstructure, which I think that we could say the same thing about Lenin as well, that like in this like kind of fantasy of the full democracy that withers away even as democracy itself, right? That actually doesn't happen because they haven't taken a serious enough account of what the political means. Neoliberalism has made the same mistake in its overt attempt to depoliticize everything, to turn all of our political conduct into just voting once every few years and then the peaceful transition of power. So she says, uh, as with Marxism, this is partly because neoliberals ignored the historically specific powers and energies in the realm whose existence it denied, the social. It is partly due to the inadequate theories of political and especially state power that would take shape in the wake of the dismantled democratic restraints on the state and in the takeover of political life by corporate titans and finance. It is also partly due to the neoliberals' failure to understand how anti-democratic, anti-social, and destructive political passions could be nourished by neoliberalism's own principles and would not be held back by the moral fabric increasingly thinned by nihilism. She returns to Nietzsche here, talks about make America great again, or France for the French, it's so they don't even try to hide their kind of ressentiment. She says, unlike the conservative, authority-oriented subject guided by conscience and closely identified with the rectitude of church and state, the new reactionary subject of repressive desublimation is largely indifferent to ethics or justice. They're emboldened by it. And then to close up here, it cannot be appealed to. She says, um, the aggrieved, I'm going to start at the beginning of the paragraph here, the aggrieved reactive creature fashioned by neoliberal reason. That creature is the Frankenstein monster, right? Fashioned by neoliberal reason and its effects, who embraces freedom without the social contract, authority, or democratic legitimacy, and vengeance without values or futurity. Um, The monster right cannot be appealed to by reason, facts, or sustained arguments because it does not want to know. It's anti-intellectual Philistinism, and it is unmotivated by consistency or depth in its values or belief in truth. It doesn't have to believe in truth. Donald Trump does not have to believe in truth. Like when he says well, like when is you lost the election, he literally just says we actually won the election. He just blatantly says the opposite of what is true, right? And doesn't care because there is no necessity. There's no beholdenness to the idea of anything like truth. In the the unleashing, the desublimation of the rage and anger that he's channeling. Its conscience is weak while its own sense of victimization and persecution runs high. It cannot be wooed by a viable alternative future where it sees no place for itself, no prospect for restoring its lost supremacy. The freedom it champions has gained credence as the needs, urges, and values of the private have become legitimate forms of public life and public expression. Having nothing left to lose, its nihilism does not simply negate, but is festive and even apocalyptic, willing to take Britain over, um, uh, take Britain over a cliff, or deny climate change, or support manifestly undemocratic powers, or put an unstable know nothing in the most powerful position on earth because it has nothing else. It probably cannot be reached or transformed, yet also has no end game. And so she leaves us with these couple of questions that are really pregnant. So what do we do with it, with this monster? And might we also need to examine the ways these logics and energies organize aspects of left responses to the contemporary predicaments? And she leaves that for another time as well. So she does at least open up the idea that maybe some of the tendencies on the left are informed by this kind of neoliberal rationality as well. And I think that that might be a useful way to consider again what that thing that I call the theological political vortex where we can't tell the difference between left and right. And at least gives us some food for thought for thinking about what our current moment is. Of course, I've characterized, and I don't think I'm wrong here. I think Wendy Brown has set herself up as somebody who is on the left as a liberal, but who is not a Marxist. Is so and is saying that something must be done if we are going to try to salvage democracy in the forces of this neoliberal Frankenstein that promotes an idea of freedom that is a completely anti-democratic, abstracted and emptied out, hollowed out notion of freedom, hollowed out of any kind of ethics, hollowed out of any kind of civic responsibility, and that is only determined by market conditions. Can we do something about that? Well, that's probably one of the current critical theoretical questions right now, right? And that will drive people's current answers. And certainly there are people on the right who have just said, yeah, it's done. The state is done. Liberal democracy is done. It's dying a slow death. This, like it or not, that's what the people on the intellectuals on the right will claim. Now, the anti-intellectuals who are like calling for MAGA nationalism or something like that, at least to the people on the intellectual right who are saying this is the liberalism is just done. Maybe the state is done itself. Like the make America great again people who believe in this kind of nationalism that they can kind of hold on to. And if we hold on to it and keep all of the immigrants out, then we're going to somehow get back the thing that we lost. Like that's a kind of lost cause. And I do think that there are people on the right who see that. But at least they see the MAGA people as and that fascist movement towards MAGA republicanism as as increasing the speed to the demolition of the state and to the demolition of democracy and to the demolition of liberalism itself. There are committed liberals on the other side, and I would probably put Wendy Brown into this camp, although she might disagree with me. So if you do, Dr. Brown, that's okay too. But uh uh who's it saying that like if we can give a kind of critical theoretical analysis, if we can do the work of critical theory, can we find that moment of intervention and change? And I think that that's what those last two questions are doing. That's why I've characterized her as a defender of liberalism from the roots of critical theory. Now, of course, there are other folks who are much further left who might also be just saying like, yeah, this is just the end of the nation state, and let's applaud the end of the nation state because it was this oppressive form. I myself am suspicious of that kind of thing because uh, we just don't know what is coming next, right? That's the question of like I don't want to claim the hubris either of saying that the state is completely done, nor am I comfortable in like just as Roger, maybe I just sound, too status quo or something here. That's fine. I just don't know. I'm just going to admit that I don't know, and I don't want to prognosticate too much, but I feel like critical theory as a discourse gives us ways to think about this. And if we were thinking about it more as a public, instead of rejecting intellectual thought, um, and rejecting education, and especially rejecting, I'm a believer in public education, so that definitely situates me somewhere politically. I believe that if we have communities that are thinking that there's something that we are ethically bound to each other in a particular way. Maybe it's more of a Levinasian way, because Levinas is deeply important to me. But nevertheless, that's a little bit of where I stand. And of course, you don't have to agree with me to pass my classes or to take this course, but that's just a transparency as part of my MO. Okay, this has been a long lecture again. I hope you are well and have a great day, evening, morning, wherever you are and whenever you are. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Um, Thank you, as always, for attention. I hope you got something out of this. I hope that I helped you understand at least where Wendy Brown is coming from, even if you don't agree with Wendy Brown. I think it's a really well-written essay, even though I don't align completely with everything that Wendy Brown says, but I definitely think it's a remarkable piece of critical theory in action in the contemporary world. Okay, take care. We'll come back to you with Glenshon Coulthard, the Yellow Knives Dene person, an indigenous person from what the colonizers call Canada. We'll come back to that in our next lecture. Bye.